what we just went over, a lot of that in detail will begin in the New Testament survey book. We will bring these back probably next week, and then that'll be it. I don't want to be hauling books around. So anyway, if you're interested, be interested. If not, that's fine. Okay, now we are talking about a historical event, that is the entrance of Jesus into the world. The Gospels are not biographies of the life of Christ. If they are biographies, they're terrible ones because they leave out 30 years or so of his life. That is not a good biography. The Gospels are rather thematic presentations of the life of Jesus. And in the back of the notes, I think beginning at page 32, we have some information about each one of the Gospels and their unique contributions that they make. But since we're not going through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I thought that would be important to at least include that for you. Now, when we're looking at historical things, we know that chronology is really the backbone of history. And so we want to take a look very briefly at a couple of chronological issues. Matthew and Luke are the two Gospels that tell us about the entrance of Jesus into the world. John and Mark, aside from John's statement that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, they do not talk about the birth of Christ. They basically begin with the ministry of John the Baptist, but we'll take a look at that momentarily. But in Luke chapter 1 and verse 5, we read this. In the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a certain priest named Zacharias, and then goes on and with the account. So Herod is very much alive at this point in time, and Matthew is even clearer. In Matthew chapter 1 and verse 25, and then going on into the next chapter, Joseph is being informed by an unnamed angel that Mary was telling the truth, that her pregnancy was because of the work of God in creating life in her womb by the Holy Spirit. So Joseph kept her a virgin until she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi came from the east. So when you look at this, and then you look at the story of the Magi, we pick up some information that's helpful. Chapter 2, verse 7, then Herod secretly called the Magi and ascertained from them the time the star appeared. When the Magi did not return to Herod, but did an end run around Jerusalem and went home, Herod is really ticked off. And so we are very familiar with verse 16. Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and its environment from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had ascertained from the Magi. So when the Magi come, the chances are that Jesus had been living in Bethlehem for about a year. I realize that this is going to be a shock to a few people, but the Magi were not at the manger. They did not go across the desert being guided by a star. There's a lot of things that have become part of our folklore that simply are not in the text of Scripture. In fact, I have now got a new test for burgeoning apostasy in the life of a Christian, if I see their manger scene and there are wise men there, it's very clear that they just don't get it. But anyway, but the problem we face is, can you imagine buying a manger scene without wise men in it? They don't make such things. So what do we do about that? This is just an aside. It has nothing to do with our course. But we have a manger scene. By the way, an olive wood manger scene made in Bethlehem. I mean, does it get more authentic than that? It's wrong on all kinds of bases, but we also got wise men in ours. But I have hung a sign around their neck which says, "We were never there." Anyway, but getting back to what we're doing here, what we know is this. The historical evidence is fairly strong that Herod died in March or April of 4 B.C. and was buried in a place called the Herodium, which is a few miles south of Jerusalem, one of his fortresses. Well, if Herod dies in the spring of 4 B.C., and Jesus was born when Herod was alive, and maybe as much as a year, then chances are that, sounds strange to us, that Jesus was born 5 years before Christ, or 4 years before Christ. Well, and you got to hand it to, I think the guy's name was Dionysius in the 5th century, 4th century. He was assigned the task of putting our calendar together. The church assigned him because they got tired of dating everything by the emergence of Rome onto the world scene. I mean, that's pagan. We want from the birth of Christ. So the guy did a pretty good job, but he was off, we think, just a little bit. And I realize that, you've seen videos and so on of lining up of planets and so on in 2 BC and that kind of thing. I think that's probably not accurate. Not that we're going to excommunicate anyone over that. But the chances are that Jesus was born 4 BC. Herod was just being careful to make sure the outer limits he figured would be 2. So probably Jesus was quite a bit less than that. Now, looking at the chronology of Jesus's ministry, his life and ministry, the contributor to that is Luke. And in Luke chapter 3 and verse 1, Luke writes, you talk about it being exact. Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip was tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Licinius was tetrarch of Abilene, in the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John in the wilderness. We call him John the Baptist. Now, so we have a very fixed date when John the Baptist began his ministry. It's the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, and there's not a lot of wiggle room because he got all these people mentioned as well. Verse 23 says this, "And when he, Jesus, began his ministry, Jesus himself was about 30 years of age." Now, the crucial word there is about. It does not say he was 30. There is flexibility there. So let's take a look at this. Assuming that the record is accurate historically, Jesus would have been born 4 BC, maybe 5 BC. The only account we have of Jesus as a child, aside from when they went to Egypt and back real quick, but any account of Jesus himself was that time when he was 12 years old and visited the temple. This is what I'm saying. These are not biographies of the life of Christ. So that's the only thing we know. Now, the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, And remember, our calendars don't exactly match up. So it would be AD 28 or 29 when John the Baptist began his ministry. Most biblical scholars believe, and I think rightly so, that John the Baptist probably ministered maybe 6 months or so before Jesus came on the scene and was baptized by John and so on. So there is some space between when John the Baptist began his ministry and Jesus did. So we arrive at the conclusion that Jesus probably began his ministry somewhere in the year 29. Now, when we go to the Gospel of John, that's where we get the best information about how long Jesus ministered. How many years, in fact, did he minister? Well, scholars who, of course, like politicians, can't agree amongst themselves on much of anything, have Jesus' ministry anywhere from 1 year to 7 years. But most probably land in between that, a ministry of about 3 years, which I think is defensible. So, in John chapter 2 and verse 13, this is right after Jesus' first miracle, the changing of water into wine in Cana of Galilee. He then went south to Jerusalem, and the reason he went south was to celebrate the Passover. So before John 2:13, you probably have, weeks, maybe a few months, and the first real-time notation is John 2:13. So John 11:55 is also a Passover, and of course that's the Passover when Jesus will now become the Passover lamb. He will be crucified at that Passover. John 6:4 also says that these events that transpired in that chapter, the bread of life discourse, was at the time of the Passover. The question mark is John 5:1, and in John chapter 5 and verse 1, this statement is made. After these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. This is most likely a major feast. Some manuscripts say the feast of the Jews, which would then say this is a Passover. But a man by the name of Harold Hoehner, in a book called Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ, that is not a catchy title, Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ. But if you ever want to do a serious study of the Gospels, that's a book you want in your library. Harold Hoehner, Hoehner, Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ. Some really good stuff in there. But what he shows is that the evidence is good and it is compelling that between John 2:13 and John 6:4, there was likely a period of about 2 years. So irrespective of what John 5:1 is saying about which feast it is, that you are probably looking at a 2-year period, thus making Jesus' ministry 3 years plus. Now, so I think that's, we're not going to die on the hill over this, but it is fairly compelling evidence that that's probably the case. So what this does then is to bring us into what year these things occurred. And it is highly unlikely, well, let me put it this way. 2 times when Pontius Pilate was governor, Passover occurred on a Friday. That was in the year 30 and again in the year 33. Well, it is really impossible that Jesus died in the year 30. I mean, he had not even gotten started with his ministry yet. And so it is most likely that Jesus died in April of 33 A.D., that's when the crucifixion took place. Which, if that is all correct, then you can see Jesus was more likely in his mid-30s, 37 maybe, because you go back and there's no year zero, and the Jews did use a lunar calendar. They had 30-day months. Anyway, Honer deals with all of this stuff. It's probably much more than any of us really want to know, but it's valuable. It's not just whistling in the dark on this. So most likely, Jesus began his ministry in late 29, and then he died on the cross, rose from the dead in April of 33 A.D. So this kind of gives us the time frame for the ministry of Christ. And again, there's a lot of good stuff been written on this. The New Testament survey book has some of this. I think, if I recall correctly, we quote from Honer in places there as well. So what we're saying then is that it's pretty good evidence that Jesus was born 4 or 5 years before Christ and died in 33. Which, by the way, I knew this 19, 20 years ago, and so I was not worried about Y2K at all. You know, some people were, because it was already 2004. It took a lot of stress out of my life, I want to tell you that. Okay, our approach in our study together is going to package the life of Christ according to 8 periods. And each one of the Gospels makes its own contribution. So what we're going to do is to follow this, and that's what your notes have as well. And you will be astounded, amazed at the titles of these periods. Period number 1, the birth and childhood. That took me weeks to come up with that title. The birth and childhood is only given in Matthew and Luke. John starts basically in eternity past, jumps up to the baptism of John the Baptist. Mark starts with the ministry of John the Baptist. Only Luke tells us about the angels, and only Matthew tells us about the wise men. Period number 2 is a period of preparation for Jesus' ministry. And as we will see, there are 3 events: the ministry of John the Baptist, the baptism of Christ, and the temptation of Christ, which prepared Jesus and prepared the nation for Jesus' ministry. All 4 of the Gospels give us information about this period of time. Period number 3 is the early ministry of Christ. Wasn't that good? The early ministry of Christ. Thank you, Wendy. A little amen from my friend Wendy down here. This is good. Now, what's interesting, though, the early ministry of Christ was about a year, and only John's Gospel talks about it. Matthew, Mark, and Luke essentially leave out the first year of Christ's ministry. Why? I have no idea why. Except I do know this, that John was the last of the gospel writers. John would have been aware that Matthew, Mark, and Luke had been written. Those are called the synoptic gospels, from 2 Greek words, sun, S-U-N, meaning with, and opsis, we get an optical from that, a seeing together. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have basically a common viewpoint of the life of Christ, so they have a lot of the same stuff. John's gospel is 90 3% unique. In other words, 93% of John's gospel cannot be found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what this tells us is that John, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, recognized that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, for whatever reasons God had in mind, left out huge amounts of material. You know, the story of Nicodemus, the story of the woman at the well, the bread of life discourse, the Good Shepherd. There are dozens of sermons. The upper room discourse basically left out of these other gospels. So what brings us to the fourth period, and Matthew, Mark, and to some extent Luke. John has some things as well, but probably the main contributors are Matthew and Mark. And what they do is go right from Jesus' successful resistance of Satan at the temptations and go right to his ministry up in Galilee. A whole year is jumped over. Fascinating, fascinating. At the end of the great Galilean ministry, which also lasted about a year, you have, and we'll be seeing this probably our third or fourth, probably our third study. We come in Matthew chapter 12, you have a pivotal moment in the ministry of Jesus when the religious leadership makes the declaration that Jesus is a fraud. He is actually doing his work in the power of Satan. And from that point on, Jesus' ministry changes dramatically. The offer of the fulfillment of the Messianic kingdom is pulled off the table to that generation, and Jesus' ministry changes dramatically in a number of ways. This is when he begins to speak in parables, to conceal truth. This is when he makes it clear there are no more miracles for the nation. This is when the subject matter changes from kingdom to start talking about his death and resurrection and the church and things like that. And this is also the time when his ministry ceases to be a broad ministry to the nation per se, but it focuses now on the training of the 12. Because while they don't know it and they sure don't understand what's about to happen, something new is coming, and they are going to be the cornerstones of that, or the foundation of it, known as the church, the body of Messiah. As Paul would explain later in Ephesians 2:20, the church is built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets. They didn't understand it at that time. And again, Matthew and Mark particularly are helpful. The next two are really all part of that last year when Jesus is focusing on the apostles and also on believing people. You know, people like Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and others who were followers of Jesus. And the later Judean ministry, Luke and John are particular contributors. This is not saying that Matthew and Mark don't say anything about it, but the bulk of our material is found in Luke and John. And then the later Perean ministry. And we're going to see that geography now plays a part, because 1 year before Jesus is going to be crucified, the religious leaders are already plotting on how to put him to death. And Jesus, knowing that, begins to stay away from the territory where the Jews and the Jewish Supreme Court, which is called the Great Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court has no authority outside of Galilee and Judea. And so what does Jesus do? He quits hanging out in Galilee and Judea. And he spends the last 3 to 4 months before the crucifixion in Perea, which is right across the Jordan River. Why does he do that? Because the Jews can't touch him there. And you find him up in Caesarea Philippi, Tyre and Sidon, places like that. Why is he there? Because the Jews can't touch him there. They have no jurisdiction. And the Romans could care less. This is a denominational squabble as far as they're concerned. They could care less that Jesus claims to be whoever he claims to be, you know? But Jesus shows wisdom. Could he have 10 legions of angels? Of course he could. But he used, if we could say, common sense. He just stayed out of their way. Then, of course, it eventually comes about that he must go to Jerusalem. And so the last about 25% of the Gospels are focused on period number 8, which, of course, is the critical period of time, is it not? That last week of Christ's life, his arrest in Gethsemane, the kangaroo courts known as the trials, and where the Jews violated their own jurisprudence. First of all, for example, you don't arrest a person and try them within 24 hours. That's illegal. It does not occur at night. The arresting parties cannot be witnesses in the trial. The defendant must have a lawyer. Jesus said, none of these things. But they were bent on getting rid of him, and that's what they thought they were doing. You know, I've often thought about Satan at this point. Satan, I think, is one confused guy. Do you put him to death or not? There's a taste of victory by killing him, but he has a sneaking suspicion because he's heard what Jesus has said, in 3 days I'm coming back, and that's really the end of Satan, in a sense. So don't feel sorry for Satan, but I don't think he really knew what to do here, but we'll talk about that maybe later. All right. So the first two periods are about 30. My guess is that Jesus was in his early 30s when he began his ministry, and then we're suggesting 3+ years of ministry. Okay, let's see what we could do. I'd like to try to get through the birth and childhood, and now that you've had all your Christmas decorations put away, we can go full bore into this. And you can write notes about what you put up next year or not. Oh, yeah. Before we do that, very critical. Before we get to the first period, the birth and childhood, we have one very strategic point. And we're on page, I don't know, what page are we on? 7. And what's happened, by the way, the pages are a little bit down. Whenever you take an electronic file and you send it off and it gets printed out, oftentimes it doesn't quite line up the same way. So every now and then you might find something carried over onto the next page, which shouldn't be. But hey, that's life. Okay. John does not begin with the birth of Jesus. He actually goes back into eternity past. John's thematic approach is to declare that Jesus of Nazareth is fully God. And that's the emphasis of his gospel. And so he begins with this well-known verse, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." It does not say that in the beginning was Jesus, and Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God, because what's being communicated here is that the coming of Jesus into the world, as the writer of the Hebrews spells out, we saw last year, that Jesus is the absolute capstone of God's revelation. A lot was given through the prophets. A lot came through angels. God said a lot of things face to face to Moses. But it is Jesus who is the absolute capstone of God's revelation. And we should add this. When we talk about Jesus being the capstone of God's revelation, we're including in that statement the apostles, because Jesus was very clear in the upper room discourse as he hands the baton off to his men. He says that through you will come revelation. You are the men who are going to give God's further revelation. So John selects the term the Word because he is the great and final communicator of God's truth. Jesus would say it later on, much to the sensibilities of our own culture. Jesus said, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. He probably wouldn't win many elections here in the States these days, but the fact remains that he is the truth. He is the anointed one. There's a definite article there. The anointed one. There aren't several anointed ones. There's only one. The text goes on to say, in the beginning was the Word. The beginning is a reference to the starting of time to time of creation. When creation came into existence, Jesus was there. Why? Well, because verse 3 will say, because he's the one who did it. He is the creator. And as Paul explains in Colossians 1, in him the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form, and he is the one who created everything and holds everything together. In the beginning was the Word, which tells us that he is before time, which tells us he is in fact eternally existent. One of the main attributes of God. Secondly, the Word was with God, which tells us that Jesus and the Father are distinct from one another. The Father is not Jesus. Jesus is not the Father. We understand, as best we can, the concept of the triunity, Father, Son, and Spirit. But what John is declaring is that this is not God the Father that is now manifested. This is Jesus Christ, who is distinct from the Father. And having said that, the Word was God. Jesus is full deity. Whatever makes God to be God is true of Jesus. He is not lacking several attributes of God. He is fully God. I would point out, by the way, when the Jehovah's Witnesses come to your door, they will say to you there is no definite article before God, and so it should be translated, and this is what their Bible translates, and the Word was a God, which of course is nonsensical, that how could he be the creator if he isn't deity? And furthermore, the Bible that the Jehovah's Witnesses use was put together, New Testament was put together by pseudo-scholars. These guys did not know Greek grammar. This is the proper way of expressing it. It actually says, God was the Word. And the emphasis is upon deity, and it's a certain kind of structure which indicates that there is never going to be a definite article there. That is just not the way it is written. It is making the statement, the Word was God. Period. That's it. So, Jesus Christ, says John, had all the attributes of deity, but he was not the Father. And then he goes on later on to express, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So, at Bethlehem, what we have recently celebrated, humanity was added to deity. Jesus was fully God, and he was fully man. He is the unique Son of God. He is the only God-man that has ever existed or ever will exist. Now, that little circle is my perhaps vain attempt to try to illustrate this. As we approach the life of Christ, we need to remember that we are talking about the person of Jesus the Messiah. The person is a God-man. He is 100% God, and he is 100% man. Now, keep in mind, when we say he's 100% man, he didn't have a sin nature. You and I don't know humanity apart from sin. I mean, that's us. But that's not what God originally created. You and I are a lesser version of what happened in Eden. We have a sin nature. We have this strong compulsion to sin. Daily, this is our strong compulsion. Jesus had no such thing. But this presents a bit of a problem to us, except when we begin to look particularly at the Apostle Paul in Philippians and in Colossians, we begin to understand something. And that is that when Jesus became a man, when he was born in Bethlehem, he temporarily gave up the use of some of his attributes of deity. He did not give up his attributes of deity. The moment you do that, he ceases to be God, including the attribute of immutability, which means he cannot change. So, when Jesus walked the hills of Galilee, for example, his glory was concealed. It only came out once and maybe twice on the Mount of Transfiguration. On the Mount of Transfiguration, it wasn't a giant spotlight hitting Jesus. He glowed from within, the natural glory that was manifested that way. And I think also when we get there in Gethsemane, when the Roman soldiers came to arrest him, a battalion came. A battalion was 600 men, plus the Jewish temple police. You say, why in the world would Rome ever send 600 men to arrest one guy? Well, you don't know Roman tactics. It was total intimidation, and there was no way that anybody was going to mess with Rome. So it was overkill always. And so here come 600 Roman soldiers into the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus says, "Who are you looking for?" "We're looking for Jesus." "I am." Boom! 600 Roman soldiers, veterans of who knows how many wars, hit the deck. Why? I would suggest that a flash of his glory leveled them, and he was communicating something: you are not arresting me. I am going with you. You are not in charge. I am in charge of the events now. And so he gave up the use of his attributes, some of the use of attributes of deity. An example. Jesus is talking about the future, and he says, he's talking about his coming and so on. The disciples say to him, "When are you coming back?" Jesus says, "I don't know." And you say, "You got to be kidding." What do you mean he doesn't know? He didn't. Because the use of the attribute of omniscience had been set aside. Now, he knew when he was coming back before he came. He knows now, but he didn't then. And as Luke will explain in Luke 2:52, he grew normally and naturally in his mental capacities. Well, not exactly like you and I. He had full operation of his brain, which none of us here have. I speak from personal experience on that one. Okay, let's get started in the birth and the childhood. Some of this I hope is familiar, so we can walk through it relatively quickly. The 400 silent years have come to pass, and Gabriel is one of the messenger angels. He apparently, according to Revelation, is one of the 7 angels that stand before the Lord of the earth. Gabriel comes with a message, and he selects an old priest. We know that Zacharias is aged because he is called. He is aged, which means he's over 60 years old. And this is recorded in Luke chapter 1, verses 5 and following. Now, here's the deal. Zacharias was of the Abijah group. David divided the priesthood into 24 divisions, according to the names of the sons of Aaron, of Levi. And so, as a result, you had 24 groups, and they would serve 2 weeks out of every year in the temple. And then on feast days, they'd bring in a whole mob of them to handle the crowds, the hundreds of thousands of people. So he's doing his thing in the temple. What they did every day when they would come into the temple is that they would draw straws to see who did what. Now, a lot of the tasks were menial and so on, but the task that it was prized above all prizes was for a common priest to incense. And the reason is the incense altar was as close as the common priest ever got to the Holy of Holies. The incense was prayers of God's people going up before the Lord. And some priests, we're told, they lived their whole lifetime. They never got to do it. This is a big deal, okay? Zacharias, we have a winner here. Zacharias, go on in, buddy. And so he goes in. Now, we'll look at this in a future study, but come on. There we go. Near the shrine of the book in Jerusalem, they have a model city of the city of Jerusalem and the temple. And we're going to go through the various aspects of the temple because a lot of what are said in the Gospels become clearer when you understand the layout and the terminology related to the temple. You see the tall building there in the center. That was the temple proper where you have the holy place and the Holy of Holies. Jesus never went in there. He was of the tribe of Judah. He would never go in there. Only Levites could go in there. Zacharias, of course, was a tribe of Levi. So he would have gone through that day through the court of women. You can see the circular staircase that would go up into the place where the sacrificial altar was and then into the temple proper. The court of women, we'll see, this is where the treasury was. Remember the story of the Jesus talking about the widow and the little amount that she gave. That's in the court of women. A number of things happened in the court of women, but we'll go through all of that. So Zacharias goes up. He goes through the door, and then he will go into the temple proper. And that doorway, by the way, just to give you some perspective, is about 60 feet high, 55 to 60 feet high. Huge. This is a huge place. So he goes in, and that's when Gabriel says to him, hey, old man, you and your old wife who have been praying about a child, you're going to get one. Your prayers have been heard. I mean, when's the last time do you think Zacharias and Elizabeth prayed for a baby? They're pushing their 65, 70 years old. They probably gave up, but God is not bound by time. And so he says, you are going to be the parents of a bouncing baby boy. But he's not just any baby boy. He is going to fulfill 2 of the prophets. He is going to be the announcer, the forerunner of John the Baptist, of Messiah, And the 2 passages are Isaiah 40 and Malachi chapter 3. Well, Gabriel appears there. I'm sure, Zacharias, as you and I would be scared spitless to have an angel all of a sudden pop up. And so he says to Gabriel, how do I know that this is going to happen? And Gabriel, in essence, said, when's the last time an angel appeared to you, buddy? And you know what? Because of your unbelief, you're not going to be able to speak, and you're not going to be able to hear. until the baby's born. And sure enough, he's now deaf and dumb for about 9 months. Goes by Walmart on the way home, picks up a whole pad of paper because he's got to be doing a lot of writing for the next 9 months. Anyway, John the Baptist is born, and this, of course, is a signal to all the people who know what's going on. I mean, this is unusual. A really, really old couple who are childless now have a boy. And the story of Gabriel is undoubtedly told, the fulfiller of Malachi and Isaiah. Well, I got these out of order. I should have another one. I thought I made the change. My apologies. Okay. I left a slide out here. Funny. Anyway, the most important slide of all. Gabriel then goes to Mary. And he goes to Mary and says to her, you, Mary, are going to become the mother of the Messiah. She does not question the reality of it. She just doesn't know how this is going to work out. I mean, I've never had sexual relations. Explain to me how this is going to work. And so Gabriel does. The Holy Spirit's going to come upon you. He's going to generate life in your womb. And the one that's born to you will be the Son of God. And he is of the line of David. And so he is going to fulfill the great Davidic covenant. Well, what does Mary do? She gets ready to head out of town because Gabriel has given her a tidbit of information, and that is your cousin Elizabeth. Remember old Elizabeth? She's pregnant. And she is going to be the mother of the forerunner of your baby, the Messiah. So Mary trots off to the hill country of Judea and will be there, I believe, when John the Baptist is born. Now, meanwhile, Mary eventually goes back home again, and by this time she's about 6 months pregnant. Can't hide this much longer. And she tells Joseph, I'm pregnant. Now, Mary is a godly girl. By the way, Mary was probably around 13 years old, maybe 14. Most girls knew who they were marrying about age 12. That was all arranged. So she would have been engaged probably at that age. Joseph would have been a little older. Usually a guy was established in business. And they were just more mature in those days. Joseph was not living in his mother's basement, playing video games. He had a trade, and he was now going to marry this girl. But now she's pregnant. And I think, Joseph and Mary both are said to be righteous people. And, Joseph just can't get his head around this thing. Give Mary, good grades for creativity, but good grief, I can't handle this. And so he's going to put her away quietly, kind of a divorce ceremony. And that's when some unnamed angel comes up and says, marry her. What the child she has is of God. It doesn't have a human father. The Spirit of God has generated life in her. And so Joseph, what does he do? He kicks the covers off, gets out of bed, finds Mary, finds the local justice of the peace or some willing rabbi. And they get married immediately because he now affords her protection. So, looking at Mary and Joseph, Jesus is not the son of Joseph, but it is the Holy Spirit. Now, Joseph and Mary had other children. I understand Roman Catholic theology, but they did have other children. 4 of them, he had 4 brothers and a minimum of 2 sisters, and they are named for us in Matthew 13:55. James will become the writer of the book of James. He will become the key man in the city, in the church in Jerusalem. Now, I'm going to go through this very, very quickly. In Matthew's gospel, he is dealing with the legal line. If Jesus is going to be king and Messiah, he's got to be from the line of David. And so what Matthew does is to take us back to the days of Solomon and bring us all the way down through Joseph. Joseph is in the legal line. And so Jesus can now legally be king, can be Messiah. Don't worry about that. In Luke's gospel, you have Nathan, who is a son of David, and it goes down through to Mary. So the bloodline is also the Davidic line. And so the necessary legal line comes through Joseph. The bloodline comes through Mary. It's a fascinating read. There are some interesting issues related to this. Now, very quickly, and with this we will end because our time is elapsed. But when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, we don't know when it was. It's highly unlikely that it was December, but the point is that he was born, came into the world, and the wise men arrived. And they arrived because they had seen the star which indicated the birth of the king. Well, where's the king of the Jews going to be? Well, Jerusalem. They didn't know anything about Bethlehem. So they go to Jerusalem and want to know, where's the king of the Jews? We saw his star in the east. Now, when you read the text carefully, the star is not a heavenly body. It's not lining up of planets and all of that. You read the story carefully, because it doesn't act like a star. Most likely, what you have here is the Shekinah glory of God. The glory of God that hovered over the tabernacle, led the people, and so on. I think this is the sign that Jesus talked about at his second coming. The sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heavens. It is the glory that indicates the presence of God. It's called the Shekinah. So anyway, they saw it in the east, and they go to Jerusalem. The star did not guide them across the desert for 3 or 4 months. It didn't do that. They go and they find out, where's baby going to be born? In Bethlehem. Well, where's Bethlehem? Well, go out the south gate, hang a left 5 miles down. They go out of the city of Jerusalem and they see the star. They haven't seen this thing in 5 months. They rejoice with exceeding great joy. What does the Shekinah do? It leads them to Bethlehem and stands over the house where Mary, Joseph, and Jesus are now living. There is no manger where they're at. It's a house. And furthermore, how in the world do you have a conjunction of planets, point out one particular house? It doesn't. The glory of God, which indicates the presence of deity. Now that makes sense to me. God has now come into the world. The Word has become flesh and dwelt among us. The wise men show up a year later. We know the terrible account of what took place. They offer, and we don't know how many. Chances are it was not 3. We don't know their names. None of that. Don't know Mary probably didn't ride on a donkey. Joseph probably didn't own one. I mean, that's, like having a Toyota or something today, It just, anyway. So they now are told, get out of town, because Herod, who is psychotic and kills anyone he thinks is going to be a rival to his throne, is after the baby. They go to Egypt. They're probably sustained there by the gold and so on. They're down there for a few months. Herod dies. They come back figuring that where should Messiah be raised? But in Bethlehem, the city of David. Angel says, no. Herod's wacky son, Archelaus, who is as wacky as his father, rules that area. Get out. So they circle around and they go up to Nazareth. And the story then begins to unfold.